I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. I really enjoyed the film, and I've been a great admirer of your career. So this is really a treat for me. I'll probably start with just a question or two broadly to introduce my viewers and readers to the film, and then delve into more specifics. So what drew you to Operation Mincemeat as a project?
Well, a unique story, obviously. Not that I necessarily anticipated, I've been waiting to make a Second World War story. It wasn't really quite that, but it is sort of unique amongst Second World War stories. Has the advantage of being probably relatively unknown, unless people have to come across Ben McIntyre's book, which was quite a bestseller over here. Actually, I don't know how much it was in America, but it mainly just the sheer strangeness of the story, the unpredictability of the story, the oddness, the eccentricity of the idea, the characters within it. And honestly, the sort of challenge of how you get control of that to tell a story, and the unexpected part of it, which I think is something that Michelle and I started to kind of look at very carefully, was how unexpectedly human the story is. If you think it's about a disinformation strategy, about persuading the hostile powers that you're going to do something different from what you're going to do, which is very specifically the domain of this kind of espionage that was going on during the war. You think that could be something pretty dry, procedurally interesting and fascinating, but nevertheless operates at a certain level. But I think what's unusual, and it's the kind of films that I tend to want to make, are films that are where the story is created and modified by character and what's happening. Because that's the point of engagement with an audience. If you're going to fall into a story like this and become involved in it and engaged by it and eventually immersed in it, then I think that's the key. It's what's happening, to the degree of relatability, I suppose, to what's happening at a human level.
That's interesting. That's one of the elements about the film I appreciated and wanted to kind of delve into with you. Is it seems like there are almost three types of filmmaking schools these days. There's one very focused on the artistry, where the characters serve the filmmaking process. There's the plot based, where characters serve the plot, which you see in a lot of blockbusters. And I think rarer these days, at least in films of this sort of scope and scale and budget, are things focused very much on character, where the plot, is sort of secondary to these character relationships that are built out. Yeah. And I was curious how, especially in something with this level of intricate plotting, you go about, keeping your focus on that pursuit of character.
Yeah, well, that's it's very well put. It's definitely the big challenge of this material, because it's not any old plot. It's quite a complex plot with various moments of iteration in it that in terms of cinematic structure, dramatic structure, offers you some very big challenges, most notably and most obviously, if you say, I don't want to reduce it to 3 acts, but in a funny kind of a way, you can analyze it in that way. If the first couple of the acts are the development of the idea and then the implementation of the idea, up to the point where they've created a complete history for this dead man and are about to give him birth as a new identity and so forth, then the third act takes all of that away. All of the characters you've been following are suddenly absent from the story while you watch how that unfolds. And you can't really start the movie again and follow the papers all the way to the Abwehr. It's just like So you have simultaneously or not simultaneously, but in a way that actually they braid together and trade importance in terms of how the story is unfolding. Where you're moving the plot forward, you're actually sharing information that the audience needs in order to be able to understand what's going on. But at the same time, that's happening in terms of what's happening to the characters involved. So it's about the making of a fiction. Films are obviously themselves about the making of a fiction. And the process that we go through when we watch a piece of fiction is that we start to become involved in the story that's being created. Then we start to sympathize with the characters that are in that story. And then that engagement deepens and so forth. And I think once we realize that that's where the drama actually lay, I mean, there isn't, you want to talk about A stories and B stories. The A story is the creation of the plot. And is it going to work? And is it going to do its job? And the B story is how those characters start to become changed and modified by the story they're creating. And then the question of whether or not it's going to work becomes bound up in what's happening to them. So it's, it looks like a sort of mechanical problem to begin with, but actually it's a sort of an iteration problem where you keep, as it were, redrafting the ideas and the way of approaching it. I mean, that's what we did. We had a long gestation process with this, while we kind of felt our way towards where the movie wanted to land. And that process went on sort of right up to and then accelerated at the point where we sort of said, okay, we got a movie. I think we've got people who want to finance it. And now we've sort of got it cast in a significant way. But even then, that process goes on. You're still wrestling with it. But it's very fascinating from that point of view. And your analysis of the kinds of movies is a good one. And we definitely fit into that last category. But that's the kind of movie I tend to like to make, although, I find plot fascinating as well. But I'm not so interested in making them the service of a kind of filmmaking of its own, sort of species, as it were. I'm not so much interested in, what other Second World War movies am I referencing here? Although, of course, it's dipping into all of those things. It's more about, fundamentally, it's a film about character, I think.
So actually, after I saw the film the first time, I went and read Ben's book. And one of the things that struck me is how so much of the most absurd elements of the plot are actually true. And yes. I was curious how you balance that almost from an audience perspective of what sort of buy-in you need to get from your audience to believe how all this stuff played out and how you kind of balance that. I realized one of the things that
it is very interesting. I mean, the sheer eccentricity of the story and the characters involved in it was both an invitation and a sort of booby trap as well. So, speaking as a filmmaker, just the oddness of it sometimes was so delicious and sort of irresistible. So, for example, when when they get to first base and Churchill has basically said, we're going to go ahead with this. And suddenly the reality of this fragile fiction has to become something else. You start to, we realized that we needed to kind of involve the audience ahead of time about the characters that might be playing a part in how the story unfolded. So you introduce, Adolf Klaus and so on, and the German spies. And those people themselves were so odd. Klaus, for example, as you know, if you've read the book, was a furniture maker and had this obsession with making collapsing chairs. Well, that was just so wonderful and so bizarre. And then when and because the film is anyway navigating certain sort of comedic back tributaries in the story, it felt quite legitimate to kind of look at that. Somebody says, as somebody says, aren't all spies eccentrics? The answer is yes. Certainly at that time they were. And so we had all that in there. And the movie could just about take it at that point. And it was funny as hell and ridiculous. I mean, this completely humorless character, with a slightly sort of sadistic edge to enjoying the humiliation of somebody. It was just very, very entertaining and interesting. And I loved it and I didn't want to let it go. And then suddenly at a certain point, this is editorial really, you start to think, no, wait a minute. I'm slowing things down here too much. And we're getting, so the simplest level of this story, there was a distillation process that had to occur, and you never, these things never happen in a perfectly orchestrated time sequence. You get to where you get to because suddenly you're making the movie, and suddenly you haven't got time to do that, or you have to sacrifice that, and so on. But yes, the idea of what was believable and what was not believable, you're just left with the feeling like, really, did they actually try this? And part of that is bound up, of course, in Churchill, too, who was himself a highly eccentric character with a corkscrew mind. And as he articulates rather well, in Michelle's words, he applauds the fantastic. It has many advantages over the mundane. But the more fantastic, the more foolproof the plan must be. Well, of course, it wasn't foolproof in any way. But at the same time, he's a man of imagination and risk and daring. It's one of the reasons he's such an iconic figure now, is that he dared to do things just simply because of the wildness of what the gain might be if it worked. And so that's partly the reason that explains why it happened. I mean, he didn't have any options. What are you going to do if you say it's so blindingly obvious that the attack would come in Sicily? So you have to figure out a way of saying, no, it won't. I mean, if you stop and think about how easy it would be to to mount an amphibious assault on the coast of Greece. I mean, it's almost impossible.
You think of the mountains. Yeah.
So, it's very, very difficult. So it demanded a lunatic idea, I suppose, which a different kind of leader would probably never have gone anywhere near. So that's part of what it is. But then you figure out, would they really have given the job of an MI5 chauffeur to that guy? But they did. And that's, who got the gig. And, and that, I mean, I had to be careful there too, because there was some sort of bizarre things going on there that I found myself winding back on a little bit. Just because you had to stay, or I felt I had to stay with the intensity of what was happening to the characters, because the big key about the third act is that really the story is being told then about their ability to know anything at all. And so instead of having to think, well, how are the papers getting to the Abwehr? And we never see that happening. We don't see that happening because our heroes don't see it happening either. And they're now guessing it. They're in a frustration of doubt and uncertainty that gradually becomes, turns into existential dread, that actually the thing they thought they had such perfect control over, down to the little tear on the theater ticket, or how plausible it might look, becomes, a screaming uncertainty about everything, which is funny initially, particularly in the early stages of when the body arrives in Spain. They suddenly find
get the autopsy
and the coroner is an expert in you couldn't really make it up. But that then starts to morph into something as the story gets deeper and pulls you in more and more and becomes a proper thriller, I suppose, which I suppose it always promises to be. But very, very interesting. A very interesting piece of narrative material to shape and model, I think.
In college, I was a history major, and I wrote actually extensively about the reflections of Western Soviet relations in James Bond movies. So there's an element of a Fleming story here that I'm very curious about.
Right.
And I think that Johnny Flynn was wonderful casting for Fleming, but I appreciated that the film seems sort of really amused and kind of in on it, almost like a glint in the eye I think of the shot of the buzzsaw watch on Flynn's wrist, and it just seems there's just this almost puckish sense of humor to it. And so I was curious about your relationship to Bond, to Fleming, and how that plays into the making of this film.
Well, it's a sort of mighty temptation. And I think I felt that, in a sense, one didn't have to make it up because it was happening, it was true. And Fraser Smith is literally a character. Charles Fraser Smith, Q, was the most eccentric man imaginable. He's absolutely brilliantly played, I think, by the actor. And so he was constructing gadgets like that, the sort of corkscrews that work backwards and watches that were buzzsaws, and didn't have any other way of thinking or working. And so I think it's the same idea that we needed to sort of pare back occasionally, so that we didn't. There wasn't a kind of light relief involved. And Michel was skillful about that, because he doesn't play a completely central part in the story. He's central geographically, but, interestingly, you're going to join us down here, Fleming. I will rather stay upstairs, which is both metaphorically and literally true. I don't want to get my hands dirty with this. We'll just see if it's a good idea or a bad idea. And I think the way that we sort of harnessed this, we didn't initially see it. And then Michel had a kind of breakthrough and said, because we thought we were going to start the film in a different way. We knew we would start it somehow in the teeth of the moment where they discover it worked or it didn't work. But we also explored the idea of starting with the death of the vagrant, actually, at one point. And then came up, Michel just threw out an idea, which was that we're being told the story by somebody, but we don't know who that person is. And she only went a certain distance with that. And then we started to feel, I thought, actually there's something very interesting here. Here is the most famous writer of espionage fiction of a particular kind, I suppose, a kind of slightly theatricalized, quasi-serious, but only quasi-serious, model of a spy. But he was 10 years away from writing that, and so we kind of suddenly realized, well, what if he is actually telling the story, sort of exercising his kind of literary chops, trying to write an account of what was happening. Which, in a sense, of course, Montague was actually doing. Another frustrated novelist, and that was sort of, and then we pushed that idea further right down to the end of the film, where now this is a really existential point, an interesting one, sort of postmodern one, where he's in the middle, the moment every writer gets to, which is, how do you end the story? Well, every filmmaker has that problem too. Yeah. And of course, there was something wonderful, which is that he's suddenly sitting in that room with this idea that he's somehow engendered, not part of the nitty gritty and the spade work, but writing an account of it, but he doesn't know how it ends. And then suddenly everything comes into the present tense. He's in a room with people who are so suffused with dread and terror that they might be presiding over and have created a massacre, that it just created such an interesting space where, for God's sake, Fleming, what are you writing? He's asked that question, and the line comes back, which would be a laugh line in a normal context, which is a spy story. He doesn't even know what a spy story is at that point in his life. And it's deeply serious to him and everybody else at that moment. So that balanced out the fun you can have with the fact that M turns out was modeled on Admiral Godfrey and Q was Fraser Smith and so on. And that actually he was absorbing the landscape of his own novels while we're in the midst of watching this film. It was a sort of sidebar pleasure, a plate of fries that while you were having the meal. But again, you just had to be careful not to tip the story off balance. And he comes back into the story at a very crucial and a very Bondian moment. when he forks out the money to pay off the sister, which everybody watches aghast while that happens, as the moral foundation for what they're doing just disappears underneath them.
And you think of the sort of blunt instrument, the Bond of Fleming in particular, in that moment too.
You totally do. And yet it's very serious, and we're not satirizing it either at that point. It's just, so you're kind of, one of the, key things that I missed having to edit the film remotely, completely, was I never saw the film with an audience until we finished it, more or less. And one of the things that was always very interesting to me was how you would get past the line, "For God's sake, Fleming, what are you writing?" Because I said to the editor, "Well, are they going to think he's writing Casino Royale?" We need to. How do we harness this? And also, but actually, it's always turned out exactly the way, if I could have articulated to myself, I would have wanted. And it took us. It's partly actually the words that he specifically employs, and Michel sent a draft back, and what his reply was, a spy story. And of course, it's what we're watching, and that's what they all are. And that's what the kind of subject of the film is. But I might have known more about what that was about had I discovered it earlier. But interesting.
I gather we're coming to the end of our time, but just one more question that I was curious to ask is, I know you're involved with, I think it's called Filmmaker, which is
yes, that's it. Yes,
which is pretty. I think it's a pretty nifty idea to have young filmmakers sort of upload shorts for really prestigious people. Yourself, I know Paul Schrader and Wim Wenders are listed as involved.
Yes, and Colin was involved in it too, actually.
Oh, yeah. And I was just curious. I just wanted to get your perspective, I guess, on where the industry goes from here. Obviously, you have a career that dates back to a British independent film through the Miramax era, through Searchlight, up until this sort of hybrid live release, streaming, Netflix, Warner Brothers release here. So I'm just curious your perspective on where the industry is going vis-a-vis something like Filmmaker.
Filmmaker, sadly, is something that has slightly kind of slipped out of focus, I think. And, I would say it's not a project that's moribund, it's just dormant. I guess everybody, it's something you had to lend your attention to and your time to. And, people get involved in projects and consumed by them, of course. Very, very interesting and worthy subject, a project, I should say. It's such a big issue, this whole thing now about, how stories are delivered. And you're absolutely right to point to we're right on the cusp of that with a film that has a theatrical distribution everywhere in the world, except for Canada, North America, and South America, which they bought out, in fact. And that's a company that would much rather probably have owned the whole world for it. But to dismantle the process by which the film was financed, we financed the film entirely on its sales, was not possible. And I'm halfway through the process because I'm now doing, Netflix-related press for this without actually having got to the point where I see how that plays out. I mean, I know how it plays out, obviously. And it's left the business sort of floating in a funny kind of ambiguity and void, very much borne out, I think, by the way the Oscars features now. It's like the Oscars have lost their purpose in some peculiar way, or certainly lost their way. They're just desperately trying to find an audience and
like the Snyder stuff.
Yes, exactly. Whereas all that used to be clearer. The little model, I suppose, that it seems sacrilegious to say so now that we know about the man himself, but the old Miramax model of small films that suddenly grew into much larger entities because of the oxygen that they developed around them through clever marketing and so forth that would then give a huge life to to smaller movies. that whole idea has sort of vanished. I still feel, however, that there is a future of a certain kind of cinema that will still exist because the simple fact is people like to experience stories with other people, and they like the idea of a destination for a story, that it's a place you go to rather than just a place where you switch things on. So now we've got a cinematic world that is a huge universe where you must see something on a massive screen in order to, get the kind of immersion that you want and push the boundaries of what the medium's capable of and how it develops. That's entirely worthy and entirely good. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got, I think, if you can curate it and cultivate it in a certain kind of way, movie houses that are smaller conglomerations of screens and so forth, keeps a kind of a smaller, independent kind of nature of storytelling available to new voices that are coming in all the time. And the streamers mean that those risks can be lower because they have a desperate need for content. But the nature of the piece economically doesn't have to rise or fall on whether it's going to make its money back. So that actually broadens the scope, I think, in a certain kind of a way that is exciting. It's hard to see exactly how it's going to reorganize itself. I mean, the one that was so curious because it was involved, Seesaw, who were involved in our film, also were involved in making Power of the Dog, which was wholly owned by Netflix, was a Netflix original. They had, they could spend whatever they wanted on it. And there's a movie that, by anybody's standards, you just sort of belonged on a big screen. Yeah. She's a filmmaker who utilizes, intimacy, sort of very, very close up intimacy, which is cinematic in its own right and juxtaposed against vast landscapes. That's the way she thinks and the way she creates. And yet that movie is only available on Netflix, apart from some, brief outings. There was sort of gigantic paradox in that. And also the sort of timeline of things became odd.
I really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you taking the time. I hope an awful lot of people see the movie this week. And I think you're talking to a friend of mine, Rowan, next. So say hello for me.
Yes, okay, Rowan's waiting.
You can apologize to him.
I'll apologize to Rowan. I'll tell him it's my fault.